Prior to going indie, I'd worked on this Legacy of Kain game. All of the deeply buried vampire lore that we had been exploring in Legacy of Kain. There was this inspiration for the game.
You're scary.
Hi, I'm Sam Barlow. I'm the director of Immortality, and we're going to be talking about the origins of this game, the character of Marissa Marcel, and just the general background for how we came up with this crazy idea. So this is the grid. The kind of core idea here was taking the idea of the edit suite and the editing machine, a moviola or what have you, and that's the metaphor for what you're doing in this game. So the idea was, imagine there's the editing room and you're stepping inside and there's like a master editor there. It's like a Thel machine maker. And you have all the footage for this lost movie is kind of laid out on the surfaces or hanging up. So you're having like the excitement and the kind of exploratory pleasure of pulling out a random piece of footage and being like, what is this? And then they put it in the machine. And now you're getting to like kind of play around with it, but without like all the tedium. The whole game is essentially the story of Marissa Marcel.
What is your name?
Marissa Marcel.
Here we have Marissa delivering her audition piece.
The sea was wet, as wet could be.
There's several layers to the inspiration here. So she's reciting this piece of Lewis Carroll. It's like a nonsense rhyme from Alice in Wonderland. Prior to going indie, I'd worked on this Legacy of Kain game that subsequently got cancelled. That was the most testing and trying experience that I'd had as a storyteller, trying to make something happen on that scale with such a big team. And then like several years later, when we started thinking about Immortality, definitely a lot of that emotion and the feeling of like this team working to try and create something against insurmountable difficulties kind of floated back up again. The Legacy of Kain game was like, there was this inspiration for the game. We were tasked with making a vampire game that would do away with all the cliches and tropes of vampire stories, because I think at the time, like Twilight, it was a big deal. So me and the writer on that went deep and we read like every vampire story. And there was a particular collection of vampire short stories, and there was a story in that called The Sea Was Wet as Wet Could Be, which is a horrific kind of retelling of this poem, and it's like extremely sinister, but not explicitly kind of vampiric take on vampirism. So that was kind of percolating. So this is kind of our marquee game mechanic. How do we create this kind of exploratory element and make like the traversal of the game be cinematic in its own way? So we talked about this idea of the cut. The kind of magic of cinema is in those surprising leaps that you can get where you cheat time and space, or like the combination of two objects together creates some kind of interesting imagery in your head. We said, well, how about making the cut literally the mechanic? Like, how does that work? And we had this idea, like, I love match cuts. Would it be possible to make it so that the player at any point can stop a piece of footage and click on something, and then we will create a match cut that will take them to somewhere else? That really appealed to me as a game mechanic because it's giving the player a ton of expressivity. There's this little dance where you're handing over to the game, and the game's going to decide where you're going to go. So where you end up can be surprising. So all of that magic of a normal film cut is kind of preserved. And we kind of know from other games and game mechanics that like random numbers and kind of randomness in game design is a super powerful tool. So, if I'm playing Diablo as a random loot drop, that is a way of taking a very simple kind of generative system that says like you can have a shiny dagger or a rusty dagger or a like jewel encrusted shiny dagger. And the randomness is what makes something feel special. But narrative gaming, usually you veer away from that, right? So this instantly got really exciting for me because I was like, well, we have this game mechanic in a narrative game where I'm making informed, interesting, expressive choices, and then the game is going to be surprising me with some randomness. And that will kind of inject a little bit of life. We have our chair. During the process of making this, we had a team of people who would go through and mark up all the objects that you could click on, and then these get animated. So every single frame, every object that feels conceivably clickable is mapped across this. We had like an early version where at any point you could just click on something and it would do the transition. And that was kind of neat, but we felt like we needed to make more of a moment and make more of a kind of game mechanic of this. So we came up with the idea of, well, having to enter symbol mode, and then you have this reticule of this little eye, and we do like a little bit of barrel distortion. So when you go into symbol mode, there's a little bit of vignetting. The way I communicated this to other people was, think of this like Pokemon Snap. You know, that is a game where you're just sat watching essentially a canned piece of movement, and then you are having to point your camera reticule and get the perfect shot. So there's this idea already baked in that people are aware of from those games. And then we have this beautiful, complicated algorithm which goes, oh, here is a chair. And then it literally looks through every single piece of footage for every single chair, and it might have some loose references. There's like some kind of fuzzy logic. So it'll be like, well, there's a stool. A stool is kind of like a chair, and it's trying to find a good match, and it's trying to find aesthetically a good match of like, where is a frame where there is a chair looking nice. We have essentially this idea of like a heartbeat, which is going on in the background. And what that does is it changes the goals of the algorithm. The longer you go without seeing something spooky, the more and more the game is going to really want to show you something spooky. And the player's not aware of any of this, right? This is all just happening beneath the surface.
That's disrespectful.
One of the things, like we were obsessed with cigarettes. The further back you go, the more people just smoked all the time. The cigarette and all of the obvious kind of sexual metaphors for the cigarette feature very strongly. Someone was keeping a running total of how many packs of herbal cigarettes we had smoked, and it was very, very huge. But it was funny because at the start of production, we were like, raise your hand if you're an actor and you consent to smoking. And I guess everyone really missed being able to walk around smoking because all the actors are like, I want to smoke. And everyone loves, like, cigarette acting is such a thing. Like having a prop makes everything so much easier. When we were doing this object tracking, we kind of did a lot of early experiments and trial and error around this kind of physical tracking and then detect when people had clicked on things. So cigarettes was a really good example, actually. If an object is in a hand, the subject then becomes the hand and the object. So then when we zoom in, we're going to frame that and use that to get the transition out. We've ended up in super wide Minsky world in an insert shot. If we want to convince people that these were actual movies, then you need the full range of shots and the full texture. Obviously, an insert shot typically is somewhat devoid of narrative, right? And there aren't going to be characters on screen. As soon as we started laying things out, we were like, well, props are really interesting things to click on. These insert shots kind of create this nice connective tissue that takes you to a different visual texture and then out again. When we see John's hand off camera, a shot like this would be shot silently because it's just an insert, but we allowed the microphone to run. You can hear Marissa Marcel teasing John.
That's not how Carl holds a cigarette.
It is now.
So I've talked a lot about cigarettes, but also goes back to the early conception of this when I talked about the research we were doing, and we were watching a lot of archival footage. But in doing all this research, Olivia Hussey was this other actress that we kind of really zeroed in on. And throughout the whole interview, Olivia Hussey is smoking like a chimney. At some point, the interviewer stops, and like his whole general vibe is slightly weird. There was something about that moment and just the vibe around it of someone like Olivia Hussey seemed older than their years, right? And the way that the BBC guy was almost treating her like an alien creature. The core spark for a lot of the story was me having this kind of wish fulfillment fantasy of, wouldn't it be cool if actually inside Olivia Hussey's head in this interview, she was as old and powerful as she feels. Like if she was actually a creature that was able to step up and rip off the head of this BBC guy. And so that kind of merged with all of the deeply buried vampire lore that we'd been exploring in Legacy of Kain. What if this character who has like the charisma and the appeal and kind of the shape-shifting nature of a sort of classic vampiric character, this magnetism or whatever that then makes them immortal, is actually inherent to their being. And that became like the really interesting thing to me, was this idea that would be a secret below the surface. And it would be a secret that we didn't tell people, that they would have to discover for themselves. And then, this is the one, letting people actually discover this truth about Marissa Marcel and having it be something that surprised them in a way that takes advantage of their familiarity with things. So, we're in this position where we're saying, hey, here's all this video. You have this expectation that the video will behave and that it will never change, that it'll be completely static. It plugs into certain parts of like popular culture, like the idea that if I play a record backwards, I will hear the devil, right? If I play the Beatles backwards, I'll hear all their satanic nonsense. Like, what if that is a way of entering into an alternate world? And so we set up all of these scenes, and so here is an example in this very first audition scene. Hidden in plain sight is this secret version of the scene. And I think pretty much, like when we were doing our focus testing and then speaking to people that played the game, like everyone would have their moment where they first discovered this stuff. Some people were like messaging me like I couldn't sleep that night, like I jumped back from my computer, like I freaked out my kids because they were like, what's happened? And it gets you in like quite a freaky primal way. And here we see every ounce of the held back frustration and anger that a Marissa Marcel might feel being exposed to the kind of bullying and sexist remarks and just general bullshit from someone like our director, Fisher. She's now bullying him. She's now making him feel painfully aware of the camera.
You're no Shakespeare, and you're not much to look at.
One of the cool things about these subverted or hidden scenes from a kind of gameplay perspective is once you've discovered them, you can treat these like a normal scene in that you can use the match cut mechanic and jump off. So one of the subtle ways in which we help people figure out the mysteries is there's like a lot of shape-shifting in the story, which again is never like super over-explained to people. So here we have the kind of supernatural essence of Marissa Marcel. If you click on her here, it's then going to do a match cut to a scene in which she's taking on the appearance of Marissa Marcel. There are other instances in the game in which this essential creature takes on the form of several other characters. And in fact, the other supernatural entity, the other, also is shape-shifting and taking on different forms. And that's something that like we don't over-explain anywhere. All you're doing is scrubbing and clicking and cutting, but just like these little ways where it's unlocking these secrets and it's revealing things to you is like a really fun part of the process. And I think one of the challenges of making something that is deliberately opaque, right? For a lot of people, like that creates this profound curiosity and challenge. Like it's a challenge to me as a player to like figure out what's going on. And I think those discoveries, things like discovering the supernatural layer, like when they feel earned, that to me is the juicy stuff, right? Like that's the really good game feeling. The downside is there are going to be people who bounce around and they're like, I just don't get it, and then they walk off. And I think the beautiful thing about all the choices, we have so much media to consume and so many games to play that I think losing those people is valid, right? If you'll see like a game like Dark Souls or Elden Ring blow up and you'll be like, yeah, you see, you can have 17 million people dig something that's obscure. Maybe we just need to add more sword combat in and that will kind of unlock that. But I think there's definitely a trade-off there.